everyone, and welcome to our podcast. In today's edition, we're going to be talking about the Sustainable Development Goal number 4, which is quality education, but more specifically on how it plays a big role in everyone's lives. Right now we have Caro, and she's going to give us more information about this.
In 2015, the UN created the Sustainable Development Goals known as SDGs. This consists in 17 goals with the purpose to be achieved by 2030, with the objective to obtain sustainability all around the world. These SDGs promote the necessary action to achieve prosperity and equity in the world by promoting social justice, human rights, and democracy. One of these SDGs is the quality education, which established that it is necessary to achieve a good education for all and break out the difference between people who can pay for private schools and the one who cannot. Also, that all people need to finish until secondary schooling with a good education without the necessity to pay. Education has an important role in our lives. In a lot of occasions, the quality of our education defines how we will live in the future, also what opportunities we will have, and in many other aspects, so that having a poor education will decrease your quality life. So a country needs to break down the difference between educations, private and public educations, to make that all their citizens have the same opportunities. This is why the education in Mexico is a relevant topic nowadays, but not only in our country. Instead, it's a problem that many countries are facing, but focusing in Mexico, there is a difference between educations, between public and private schools. Each citizen thinks different of what is better, so we will find out what people think about education in Mexico.
Today we have an interview with Cecile Roman, a high school student that is currently on her last year of high school in Prepa 9 in Guadalajara, Jalisco, Mexico. First question, have you studied in a public or a private school?
I have studied in both, though I'm currently studying in a public school.
Was it your decision to study in a public school?
It wasn't, because at the time I went in, I was underage, so my parents chose it for me.
If you were to hire someone, would it affect your decision if the person studied in a public or in a private school, and why?
I believe it would, because I believe that people in public schools are more used to working in teams and dealing with different kinds of personalities than in private schools.
So you would prefer someone that comes from a public school than from a private one?
I believe so.
What's your general opinion on Mexican education?
Well, I believe that our educational system is really awful, because I believe that in Mexico we are told to forget what we like and with what we long to and focus on things that we sometimes don't even care about, so we became ashamed of what we love.
What do you think, besides payment, it's the main difference between private and public schools?
Well, I believe that in public schools it's more difficult to get in and to get out as well, because in a public school you are competing for your place there, and in a private school you are paying for it. So I believe that though it can be difficult to get into a private school, it can be hardest to go into a public one.
Next up, we have Brian Kilkenny, a Prepa Tech Santa Anita teacher who was born and raised in the United States.
Have you studied in a public or private school?
I studied in public schools, public elementary, public high school, and the state university, which is also considered public.
Was it your decision?
In the United States, the public school system is the norm. Most people study there. I didn't really have a choice. People who go to private schools, it's really for religious purposes. The state school, that was my choice.
If you were to hire someone, would it affect your decision if the person studied in a public school?
In the United States, it wouldn't matter to me if they studied in a public or private school. Here in Mexico, I would choose someone who studied in a private school.
And why?
Because I think that the private universities here in Mexico and the private high schools have more or higher standards of quality for their education and for their teachers than the public school system.
What is your general opinion on Mexican education?
In general, I think that the SEP is a great organization and they try really hard to create really good educational programs. But in the implementation is where Mexico is lacking. You don't have the funds to build decent schools with decent facilities and equipment in them, and you don't have the facilities to train the teachers. So these teachers have a great program, but they don't have the tools, resources, or even the training to really implement them well. And that's what I see as the big problem with Mexico education.
Besides payment, what is the main difference between private and public education?
Well, I think it's just what I mentioned. The private schools have the resources to have internet in the school, to have projectors and computer labs, and to train their teachers more than the public school system. That's the biggest difference.
Do you think that you not having paid the same amount as someone who went to a private school, you have less opportunities?
No,
Why?
I don't. Well, it's different in the United States than it is here. In the United States, your education gets you to the next step. But once you're in that next step, it's based on what you've done. So the school you left, the school you studied at, university, it might help you get a better first job. But after 2 years in that job, then it's all based on your work performance. Here in Mexico, I think that the businesses, I think it's more important, that first step, because a lot of businesses won't hire public university graduates because they have this bad reputation. And so if they never get hired, then they're at a complete disadvantage from that point on.
Okay. Those were all the questions. And finally, we have Monse, a Mexican middle school girl who is about to graduate and start studying in high school. The first question is, have you studied in a public or a private school, and was it your decision?
I studied in a private school. It was my parents' decision, but I like it, so it doesn't matter.
If you were to hire someone, would it affect your decision if the person studied in a public school, and why?
It will not affect my decision because I think that what matters is that the person is able to do the job.
What's your general opinion on Mexican education? And besides payment, what do you think is the main difference between private and public education?
I think the education system in Mexico is not the best and it could improve. And I think that the main difference could be the teachers and level of education.
And lastly, do you think that if you would have studied in a public school, you would have less opportunities than you have right now? And why?
Well, maybe because I had many opportunities to study in other countries for like a month or during the summer, and many public schools don't have those kind of opportunities.
Those were all the questions and interviews for today. Thanks everyone who took the time to answer them. And now Caro has something to tell us.
In other words, the education in Mexico is different between a public and private schools. Private schools get an advantage. In the interviews, we can notice that people in private schools think that a private education is better than a public, but people in public schools say the opposite. Besides that, all interviews agree that education in Mexico is very bad. Students do not get prepared as they need. Mexico is a big country. They have people that can create great things, but education in here is a problem. In other countries like the US, both public and private schools are very good, and there is not a big difference between them. Almost the countries more developed are like the way as the US is. So if Mexico improves its education, it can improve as a country, because it will be creating more opportunities in all their citizens.